All right, Sir Eric. Welcome to this week's episode of the Herbal Hour. This week we are going to be talking about history. So you're a history teacher, and been interested in history for quite some time as well. And specifically, where our interest comes together is how an understanding of history can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves, of our lives, of our own minds, and how it can actually lead to healing of ancestral traumas, how it can lead us to having direction, meaning in our lives, how to learn from other people's mistakes, and how to not repeat the same errors. So, can you tell our audience a little bit about the work that you do within the sphere of history?
Sure, Bogdan, and thank you so much for having me again. It's an honor as always. So I teach primarily ninth and 10th grade history, which is global history in the state of New York. Ninth grade focuses on basically the beginning from ancient Mesopotamia in Egypt all the way up to the Enlightenment era, which is about 1700, 1750 CE or AD in Europe. And then global history 2 in 10th grade picks up where the global 1 left off, and you go all the way pretty much to modern times, even with like the Arab Spring in the Middle East. So I get to teach it all, which is great. I am kind of anxious to maybe teach US history one day as well, but I would say I enjoy the ancient stuff, the global stuff much more. The kids do, I think, in some way also, because it allows them to get a whole scope of different cultures, introduce yourself to different cultures, different achievements from throughout the world over time. American history is just one very small snapshot. Uh, so I think that ultimately I'm very lucky to be teaching what I teach. I'm also a very proud Greek American. And so I think I'm very, very blessed to be able to teach about Greek history every year. I spend a lot of time on democracy, especially on philosophy. I teach a philosophy course at my school as well. I just spent a lot of time in Plato's Republic, particularly the cave allegory. So yeah, it's a wonderful occupation to have. And I think I knew I wanted to be a history teacher pretty much early on in high school. My own history teachers very much influenced me. They just looked like they were having the time of their lives. And I thought that's what I want to do with my life.
Mm. I was thinking about this a little bit, and history, in a sense, is really about the stories of humanity and the stories of how the human psyche expresses itself on a collective stage. And even the reporting of history tells a story because you choose certain events to talk about in a certain way rather than others, which actually shows us more about ourselves than the actual events. Now, I had a question for you. So, something that I've noticed that's kind of peculiar myself is I find myself very specifically drawn to Greek mythology. And I wonder if there's some kind of ancestral memory or something along those lines where if you're more from within a Western tradition, the Western traditions of mythology and history seem to have more of a pull. Whereas we both studied a lot of Eastern philosophy back in our day and still do to some extent. When I read their mythologies, they didn't really have the same pull. Like the philosophical ideas of awareness, mindfulness, love, those things had a pull. But something about the Greek gods specifically, what do you think that is? What is the appealing aspect of that to the Western minds?
Well, that's a great question because that is most likely the case. And I think Carl Jung would have a lot to say about this as well, that we are very much pulled with the Western mindset. It's almost dangerous, he would say, to go out too far into the East and lose that sense of ego that we've worked so hard to cultivate out here in the West, perhaps to our detriment. But I would say that, and I'm going to use your background, ethnic background as an example here, because the Ukrainians were heavily influenced by the Greek culture. And we teach this every year, how basically during the Byzantine Empire, which was the remnants of the Roman Empire, but basically with the Greek culture, Greek language, the Ukrainians, the Rus people, the Kievan Rus, right, the origins of the Russian culture as well, those people were heavily influenced by the Byzantines, who basically spread the Christian religion up north. So I think there is there's a connection there that you can look at as well, linguistically, culturally, through our religious beliefs. And yes, those beliefs they're much later than the Greek gods in the Greek mythology, those tales, but I still think that there's that tie that kind of binds us all together. Now, to get back to the Greek gods, in particular the mythological stories, there are so many of them that we could look at. And they've been broken down throughout history, especially during the Romantic era. The Germans did a great job of this. Nietzsche looks at this in depth, and I think a lot of plays, even Shakespearean plays, play on a lot of these motifs from the Greek myths. So I think they just represent our highly developed sense of self and identity out in the West here. So there's a story for every, basically any sort of situation a human can find themselves getting into, right? I think everyone likes to make jokes about Zeus and his philandering and whatnot, but there are other great stories. And in philosophy, for instance, Sisyphus, the myth of Sisyphus, is a very timeless tale that we come back to over and over again, kind of representing the futile endeavors of humanity and how we think we're doing something really great with our time here on Earth, but are we just rolling a rock up a hill so it can roll back down again, right?
Can
Is
you
there any purpose to this?
elaborate a little bit more on the myth of Sisyphus, for people who haven't heard about it?
Sure, and I don't know that much about it. I kind of do know the general fact of this. I know your friend Jake loves this myth in particular. But yeah, basically there's this guy named Sisyphus, and he is essentially doomed to have to bring this very heavy boulder up a hill his entire life. And then once he gets there, he rolls back down. He has to do it again. I tie it in with, oh man, I'm forgetting the name of this guy. You could probably help me out right now. The guy who gets his liver, yes, thank you, Prometheus, the guy with his liver getting plucked out because he gave the fire of the gods to humanity. So there are these motifs of eternal punishment to people that either help humans or either people that maybe like relate to the nature of what it means to be human.
All right, so I want to share a quote from Carl Jung, who we're going to be talking a good amount. So for anyone who doesn't know, he was a very well-known psychologist during the early 1900s. The ideas of archetypes, the shadow, the collective unconscious, they basically come from him. A lot of the ideas within the New Age movements come from his original writings. And he had a very interesting view on history and what the deeper psychological meaning of history was. So he says, "Who has fully realized that history is not contained in thick books, but lives in our very blood? And the unconscious is the unwritten history of mankind from time unrecorded." So the question is, how is history something that's living through us, that's influencing us, and that we're creating? And what can we learn from history to keep it from repeating itself? There's a lot of questions there, so you just tackle whichever one you want.
Yeah, that's loaded, Bogdan. But that is the task at hand, especially when we deal with history, because a lot of kids always are wondering, what is the point of this? Why are we learning this? Is there a greater purpose? And a lot of people fall back to, well, we don't want to repeat history. We don't want to repeat history. There are things that we can learn from history that are good, and they can teach us that we do want to repeat some of these things. I'm trying to think, for an example, when we come up with new technologies, right? So the advent of farming, the agricultural revolution, those are very beneficial advancements for humanity. Now, I do start my year off with this, ninth grade, and I do like to play devil's advocate and ask the kids, maybe were we better off in the Paleolithic era when we were nomadic hunter-gatherers? Because there is evidence of this. There's an article by Jared Diamond, and he wrote a bunch of books about this also. People are interested in looking into Jared Diamond and his theory that perhaps the greatest mistake humanity ever made was to become sedentary, to settle and become an agricultural-based society. Because perhaps, actually, when you look at the dietary basically makeup of a hunter-gatherer society, a nomadic society versus a society that is sedentary and farming, we get a lot more nutrients from the hunting and gathering nomadic society, or that lifestyle rather, because you're getting nuts and berries, you are getting meat and protein-based diet. It's more like a keto sort of diet, and you're getting a lot more carbs with the agricultural-based diet. And what they found is that basically people's life expectancies got shorter when we switch to the agricultural based society. Now we are more protected from animals when we're settled. There definitely are benefits to the settled society, but those some of those facts regarding our diet, those are unavoidable. Even our teeth become less healthy when we live in an agricultural society. So I always think it's great to start the year off that way, to kind of show kids that whatever you think history is, you might learn that maybe it's not what you expected. I think it's really good to challenge misconceptions in history. I think that's the best way to learn, is to look at different perspectives and not just say, these are the facts, this is what happened, and this is what we need to know about it. Because that's not, to me, that's not genuine. That's not a genuine practice of history where we're actually examining. And what do you do when you try to learn about history? You examine artifacts, right? You
Mm.
examine old texts. You can't just let one person read it and tell the story and that's it, and you write it in pen or in ink. History should be written in pencil. You need to erase it at times. New evidence will show itself, very much like in the medical field or in the scientific field. And it's very important that we allow for those changes to manifest themselves. Otherwise, we will repeat the same mistakes of the past
Mm.
in kind of having a monolithic view of what is and what isn't.
Yeah, and I believe there's a lot that we can learn from history that actually applies to us now. Like, for example, the thing we were just speaking about is talking about how a new technology, although it seems like it will lead to good, can have unforeseen negative consequences. And that's kind of a repeated motif through history, is people thought this was for the better and it actually led to this, that, and this. Like, for example, colonialization. I mean, the Native American people were essentially decimated by disease. And that's a common thread through the history of medicine, is when people who have not been in contact come into contact, they spread all sorts of unimaginable things. And we live in a incredibly interconnected world now. So with everything that's going on, as everyone's very well aware, it's very hard to get away from that fact, because it's almost like we're not even really nations anymore, because everything is so cosmopolitan. Everyone's traveling around from this to that country, that what affects one country affects the whole world, which is as we're seeing. So what do you think in these times history can teach us about how to react to a mass scenario as is occurring now, with, you know, all the quarantines and canceling of events, and this effort to contain this contagion, which is well intentioned, but what can be some of the negative detriments to acting in such a way, or what could be some of the positive things that we don't expect?
Excellent question, Bogdan, and I'm glad we jumped into this. There are two things I'd like to say, and I'll start first with, I'll go into a historical example of a time when a plague hit. And people did not foresee the plague hitting. This was something that occurred because of other actions that were taken prior for other reasons, other necessary measures that were taken because of a war. So during the Peloponnesian War, roughly fought between about 430 BC into 403 BCE, between the Greeks, it's between different Greek city-states, the Athenians and the Spartans. And Assassin's Creed Odyssey, by the way, great game. Don't mean to advertise out of nowhere here, but that game actually puts you into that war, which is awesome because you get to learn about the times that they're playing through. During that time period, in some ways, it was a golden age. You had some of the greatest thinkers alive, born or living during that time. Hippocrates, the father of medicine. Socrates, the father of philosophy, Western philosophy in many ways. These are all people that are living during that time, which, you think of war. Wars are, terrible times. But even during a war, there can be an opportunity for growth, innovation, new ideas and beliefs, and what have you. So during this war, when it began, you basically have Athens, which is a trading empire, very strong navy, not so great at maybe land fighting. And Sparta is obviously, as we know, if anyone's seen 300, for instance, they base their entire society off of that. They're a militaristic society. From the age of 7, young boys, they are taken from their mothers, right? And they probably wanted to be, because they were taught from a young age, this is what you're going to do. This is your future. You're going to, be the first body of defense, line of defense against any invaders, against our perfect society of Sparta. And Hitler loved Sparta. He thought he was he admired Sparta greatly. So these young boys are taken to a camp called the Agoge, where they would train. And overall, some of them, a lot of these boys would not make it through the first few years. They were given a cloak, uh, basically told they needed to steal to survive through these first few years. And if you got caught stealing, even though you were basically told to do that, you would be whipped mercilessly, perhaps even, to your death. So it was basically survival of the fittest. And we don't want anyone who's potentially weak to have to be the people that are representing our city-state or fighting for our city-state. So the Athenians obviously were worried about fighting these people because they have been training all their lives. They are super soldiers, almost robotic, if you will. These people, they wanted to die on the battlefield. There was no higher honor than to die on the battlefield, like the samurai or Vikings, perhaps, and other cultures that we see. So the Athenians were wise to this. And they were, obviously the Athenians, we think of them as the philosophers, the playwrights. These are, Euripides lived during this time as well. Aristophanes, some of the greatest playwrights that we know about today, lived during these time periods, the golden age of Athens, right? So Pericles, the leader of Athens at the time, great, leader of democracy, really opened up democracy to the masses in Athens. And basically, he decided that a great strategy would be had to not directly face the Spartans head on. And they would use their naval acuity, their naval powers, to their advantage here. Essentially, they would wall themselves off behind the walls of Athens, so they would never have to face the Spartans head on. And they would use their navy, their superior navy, in order to be able to get resources into the city so they could survive a siege for however long they needed to. Okay, and it was a smart strategy at the outset of the war. It made sense for the Athenians not to play into the advantage, the great advantage that the Spartans had over them. And so the war plays on for, about, like I said, 27 to 30 years long. And towards, I guess, in the middle way of the war, there are battles being fought outside of Greece and Sicily. There are battles being fought all over Greece, but never in Athens, particularly. The city is walled off. Eventually, much to the chagrin of Pericles and his generals and strategic people. In Greek, they call them strategos, general. So my dual language there is kind of messing me up there. Statisticians, that's the word I'm looking for. They faced a big problem. And the problem was that because people were not allowed to leave the city and people were walled in for this extended period of time, a great plague struck. Historians like to call it perhaps an early form of typhoid fever. And there are great accounts of this plague. Thucydides in particular, really, and he has a whole history of the Peloponnesian War if anyone's interested in looking into this more hand. And it is extensive. He's considered the first historian in some ways, even better than Herodotus. He's much more scientific. He gives you direct quotes of different, leaders and city-states, representatives throughout Athens and throughout the Greek world at the time. He tells us that basically this thing is a disaster. A great majority of the population of Athens passes due to this plague. Pericles himself, the great, mastermind of this plan to not fight the Spartans, dies in this plague. And ultimately, this plague really does lead to the downfall of the Athenians. So this great idea that really should have led to their victory long-term ends up leading to their downfall. And so I think that's a very important part of history here. That's how we can learn from history, is we might want to be careful with our recommendations in the face of certain, circumstances that we're facing. So right now, telling people to stay inside, to avoid public places, is probably prudent for where we are in the very beginning of the onset of this pandemic, especially, localized in the United States. However, you don't want people, especially this time of year, to stay inside too long, because outside is where all essentially the tools are to perhaps fight this, novel virus. You want to go outside, you want to get sunlight, you want to breathe in fresh air, you want to get exercise. You don't want to stay at home basically brooding in your, I don't want to say misery, but perhaps in our uncertainty and our anxieties too long. And so I think it's very important right now that we listen, to the authorities, because in some ways we don't want to find out what happens if you don't at this early stage. But we also, want to take all the necessary measures to put ourselves in a position to keep our immune system strong. I read an article the other day that was talking about how the Spanish flu in 1918,
Hmm.
which was a very, deadly flu. It killed a lot of young people. People 18 to 25 were the majority of people who were killed during this pandemic. They did a study where the people who were treated during this 1918 pandemic, if they were treated outside in the sunlight and fresh air, they got better much quicker. Statistically, they were able to heal and not succumb to this illness versus people who were sequestered indoors being treated. In the same way, in some ways, the same medicine and the same tactics as were the people outside. So I think it's important to take those lessons from the past, like even, they're peppered throughout the past, these lessons. You take one from one time period, you take another one from another, you kind of merge them together. You can't look at a single event in history isolated. They're all connected to each other. And I think that's where the power of history to teach us how to heal comes from. You can read one book about history. You can read 1,000 books about history. You can spit off facts and be on Jeopardy and win, $1 million. But it means nothing if you can't take these facts and kind of put them together and create a real perspective, a real narrative of history that is all-encompassing. And that really will teach people all there is to know about ourselves and about where we're going and about what our ancestors knew or did not know to their detriment or to their benefit in the past.
Hmm. Yeah, you brought up some really interesting points about the fact that the temporary response seems very warranted to spread, but something we were talking about previously is what are the long-term implications of a strategy of, you were mentioning a quarantine that could potentially be lasting for many months or even longer. What are the effects of this kind of mentality on us throughout, that after this outbreak passes, things might never be the same? I mean, for example, during the aftermath of September 11th, there was a lot of legislature that was passed that, although intention to lead to the capture of terrorists and things like that, ended up changing the political sphere and changing laws and regulations in ways that are still affecting us today. For example, Snowden revealed a lot of the things that were ultimately the fruits of this mass hysteria that followed and the legislation that was kind of brought through at the same time. And I think that that's an important thing to bring in about all of this is when hysteria sets in, a lot of decisions can be made that might affect us for a very long time and not in a necessarily beneficial way. It's like that classic um, struggle between liberty and security, right?
Yes.
It's like, what amount of intervention in everyday life is warranted to come together to prevent the spread of something like this? And that's the thing about history, is like a lot of very well-intentioned efforts, they have disastrous fruit that are very hard to predict. um so, and another aspect too, like you said, being outside, I mean, that's super helpful. And the question is, what aspect of being in a state of fear, I mean, that just destroys your immune system, everything that we understand about how stress impacts us. So when you're very stressed out, your cortisol levels obviously increase, and that directly suppresses your immune response. So if you're indoors, not getting fresh air, you're afraid to go outside, afraid to contact people, what effect does that have not only on mental health, what effect does that have on just how strong our immune system can be resilient to the passing through of an outbreak such as this? And obviously, there's a lot of information coming out that this certain virus doesn't hold up very well in sunlight.
Hmm.
And everyone understands that, being trapped indoors is not really good for your mental well-being. It's not really good for your immune system. So we're seeing something very interesting happening right before our eyes, and I'm fascinated to see what the long-term implications of this will be. For example, schools have been closing. My clinic closed for a week, and it's interesting too, because if these things are closing, then who's there to help the people that actually need the help? It's like it's everything is up in the air, and I think a lot of people are very scared, and unsure of what to do. Um, and hopefully all we can do is just keep our cool, do what we need to do to make it through this, and to cooperate and make sure that this all passes over smoothly without too much panic.
Well, I think Bogdan, I mean, you break up a lot of great points there, and I guess I'm going to focus on the fact that because the people in power don't know how we would react to a situation like this, I think that's why you're seeing so much fear being pushed, because they don't. The people, if we just disregard what they're saying, and go out and mingle with each other, that could lead to social unrest. So I think about the Hong Kong protests or the Yellow Vest movement in Paris, that these things were ongoing for months before this. Only something like this could actually get those movements to actually slow down or just dissipate entirely. So there are, like you said, benefits or just long-term repercussions for what we're dealing with here. And those are the more negative ones. I want to get more back to you said about school closures, because obviously, I'm in a state now where my school is also closed for at least 2 weeks. It seems like it will be for at least the month of April as well, because we are talking about long-term remote learning. And my district in particular is still trying to figure out what that looks like and how that is. I obviously have an idea, because ultimately as individuals, we have to, figure things out for ourselves. We can't just wait for the authorities to necessarily tell us what to do and how to do it. But when I first started teaching, I was amazed at how dependent our society is upon public education, especially children. They get their meals from the school. They'll get their breakfast and their lunch from the school. And I never realized to what extent that our society is dependent upon public education for literally, allowing people to be able to go to work because their kids are at school for the day. It's almost like glorified daycare in some way. Now,
Mhm.
I don't want to make it seem that way, but maybe when they're younger in elementary school, it is a little more like that. But, hopefully in middle school, high school, we're giving the kids an intensive enough education that it's worth it for them to go out during the day, and they will learn something worthwhile that they could take with them, wherever they go on their life paths. So I think right now it is unprecedented. We want to provide students with not just education in their time away from school, but also the means to a healthy nutritional diet on top of that. So it's almost like a social net, a social safety net is the education system in our society. So this is unprecedented. We are only in the beginning phases of this, and we really don't know where we're even going to be in a week, let alone a month to 6 months. In the last week, we've all been hit with these realities now that are, we're being told they're going to be with us for a very long time. And so to see how people are responding in just the last few hours versus how we will be responding, months from now, particularly, there is no way for us to really know about this. And I think this is a really much an experiment to see how humans react to a situation like this. Now, we just talked before how this is obviously, plagues and holding people in, or quarantines rather, keeping people into a place for an extended period of time to stop the spread of an illness is not unprecedented. These are things that have happened throughout history. There are bigger plagues, there are plagues that'll probably be much more deadly than this one when we look back at this, when it's all said and done. But still, it's a scary thing to be told. You have to, can't leave your house. You have to stay home. You have to, you can't go out by, even see people that you love. Stay away from your loved ones. You could be infecting them. It makes us all feel, in a sense, that we are, I don't want to say that we're deadly, but that we could potentially be, have a negative effect on people, even people that we love, that we want to help. So even now, like, our instinct is to go out to help people, help the elderly, right? Help the children. But now we're so worried, like, oh my God, I might have this bug. I don't want to help anyone. I think helping myself means staying home and just like crawling up into a hole and closing my eyes, you know what I mean? And just like totally melting down. And I think that's what it comes into. You're talking about the mental state, the morale of the people right now. The morale is very low. And what have we based our morale on for all these years? It's hard to say. Collectively, what have we based our morale on? Sports, for sure, right? And listen, I enjoy playing sports. I enjoy watching sporting events. Honestly, when basketball and baseball is being delayed, all these things are being postponed, I was, unhappy with that, because it's a casual joy. It's something that we can enjoy, without having to think too much about, put it on in the background. Oh, life is normal. Everything's going so great. Oh, something bad happened today. Well, I'll watch the Knicks game tonight. It is what it is. I'll kind of blow off some steam. And now people don't have that anymore. And people don't know what to do with themselves. All the sports gamblers, people are joking. They're going to bet on the weather now because there's nothing else to bet on, right? It's like, oh, this
That's
is
hilarious,
this is
man.
end of the world. It is. It's incredible. But that is something that we're coping with. They're only in the beginning stages of. People are going to have to go back to some of those natural things that we used to do, like spend some time outside, turn off the TV, perhaps. I'm very lucky to be able to play music. I know you play music as well. Guitar, piano, singing. We can all sing. We can all chant. That is something that, even if you're not a good singer, I'm maybe at best a decent singer. I still do it to calm myself down, to kind of open up my vocal cords. It's good for your thyroid, right? I mean, I'm not trying to give medical advice here, but, I'm just thinking you stimulate, certain glands when you do that. So I think it's important right now more than ever that we really try to figure out what we're going to do with our time here, and we start doing it. We don't spend too much time just thinking about how many Netflix shows can I binge in the next week and a half, because that's the old way of doing things. So that's not going to cut it anymore. We need to figure out a new way. We've been blessed with the opportunity now to figure out a new way to do these things. And I think, at first it's going to be painful, like all growth, but it's really going to pay off in the long run. You're already seeing, I'm going long here, but we're already seeing pollution going down in places that have shut down. In China in particular, the first 2 months of the pandemic there, you look at a map, or rather a satellite image of over China, and the pollution has gone down exponentially. So there are some unforeseen benefits, perhaps, to the shutting down of society that we are not privy to just yet. So it's very important to not panic. As much as we're being told to panic, and yet we're also being told not to panic at the same time by the same people, and we're all just our minds are spinning, right? It's incredible to see how this is going on. But ultimately, I think this is an opportunity for growth. I know that's very much what the people in charge like to do, is create a crisis so that they can create, like you said, 9/11 was just a precursor to plans that were being hatched much longer before the actual event happened. There's the project for the New American Century document. I just love referencing that because everyone should take a look at that. It was written in 1997 by Mr. Cheney, by some of his friends that were a part of the Bush administration. And they had planned for what they call multi-theater wars. Basically a way for America to have a purpose to continue imperializing the world into the next century. Because we needed a new enemy, right? Communism is done. The war on drugs, was kind of petering out. So we needed a new war. We needed a war on terror, and that was very convenient for not just, it's not just Republicans or Bush. There's a lot of people that stood to gain from this long-term strategy of a conquest, imperialization across the world. It's not just about oil. There's a lot more that goes into it than just the oil memes on Facebook. It's very deep. The military-industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, there's a lot of benefit. The petrodollar itself also, but I digress. So go ahead.
Yeah, it brings up the point that during times of fear and uncertainty, that we need to keep our cool so that there isn't worse consequences than we could have foreseen. And I think this is a great place to bring in the idea that one of the things that we can learn from history, one of the things that we can apply in our lives and in our health, in our psychic health especially, is that things that happen outside of us, they cause us to respond in a certain way. And the way that we respond is actually more of an indication of us than it is of the external events. So I'll give you an example with this outbreak. So the minute it becomes a fear of, shortages of food, shortages of toilet paper, instantly there's almost this instinctual response of like, oh no, got to protect myself. And this underlying notion that we have of ourselves is very good and helpful to other people. That's challenged by the reality of when you're in survival mode, you suddenly start thinking in more of a selfish way. of how you can protect yourself, and that's understandable from a survival perspective.
Yeah.
But what I think all this is indicating is this outbreak is presenting what we are, what human nature is in all of its complexity. Because on the one hand, you have people hoarding supplies, maybe taking away from other people that really need them. And on the other hand, you have people who are in the medical communities, who are doing their best to help people, who are, providing resources for each other, who are going out and helping elderly people that might need help during these times. And there's this very interesting aspect of human nature is coming out of the multifaceted nature of us, that like we both have like very good aspects and we have evil self-seeking aspects. um and I think it's providing, as you said, an incredible opportunity for growth to think like, what is really important in my life? Is it just all about me, or maybe there's something I can do to help? And I think that how we respond is going to be very indicative of who we are as really a society, of what kind of people are we? Are we the kind of people that just hide indoors and fend for ourselves? Or are we people who take risks to help other people, perhaps in situations where they need it? Because of, I mean, it's a crazy situation out here. It's not like rent is not going to be due. And if you don't
Absolutely.
have work, what are you going to do? And if the quarantine proceeds in any sense or gets worse, where there actually is like mandated quarantines, like curfews set on houses and things like that, what's going to be the reaction to that? I mean, we see throughout history these events of when natural disasters strike or big political unrest happens, that people just start rioting and looting. Like,
Yes.
is that what we're heading towards? With, I
Well, I'll
certainly
say
hope not.
that's a great point you make, because I think we're very lucky that we haven't seen that yet.
Right.
And I think we've sort of seen that in a controlled way, with people rushing to stores and buying all the hand sanitizer, buying all the toilet paper. In some ways, that's like organized looting, I would say. It's wild out there, but that's really the ultimate worry, right? Is that society as we know it, civilization as we know it, will cease to exist. It will break down. It already is ceasing to exist. It already is breaking down. That is essentially what is happening, but it could be much, much worse. It could be much more disorganized. It could lead to unnecessary calamities. So my hope is that we will see the rise of heroes during this time, rather than the collective release of humanity's shadow aspects. Now, I
Mm.
think we're already seeing that, but I think it's slowly being released, almost like steam from a tea kettle when it's hot. I think we're slowly being released now. We're allowing ourselves to kind of release these darker aspects of ourselves and see them and cope with them in the right way. And I think ultimately this will lead to, like what we said before, a positive outcome for humanity. Um, yeah, no, I think with the quarantines, with I think in New York City in particular, talking about they're calling it a shelter in place right now, because they're not going to call it quarantine. I think they're trying to create a new, almost like new speak word to kind of get people to be, to comply with what's going on. I think that's probably not a bad thing. I'm very glad I don't live in New York City, obviously. I live in upstate New York, a lot of trees up here. I could walk out of my backyard if I need to, or out on my deck just to get some fresh air. Because if you're living in an apartment building, in any city across America right now, you're kind of limited, especially if you are forced to stay in your home, on where you can do and the quality of air that you're breathing. Uh, it's concerning, but this is why we have to hope that this doesn't last as long as we're being told it potentially might. Um, but all we can do is kind of wait and see. And so it's imperative that our morale, our psyche, we try to stay as positive as possible, because if the worst does come to roost, we really must be in, like you said, the right mind state to respond to
Mhm.
our external circumstances in order to be able to move forward in a non-detrimental way.
Yeah, and I think this is a good place to go into what happened during World War II. How during World War II, all of the strife that was going on, the warfare, it brought out a lot of the worst aspects of humanity. It also brought out a lot of good aspects of humanity.
Sure.
But what always fascinates me about World War II is that a lot of the atrocities committed by by Germany were just done by ordinary people.
Yes.
That like they were obviously it was state sponsored. You know, the state
Yeah.
was telling people to go out and do this, that, and this. Um, but there was many moral transgressions that happened on a very individual basis where it's like just because shit has hit the fan doesn't mean that we don't have moral responsibility anymore, because what the effects of not taking that moral responsibility can be now can be really disastrous, can lead to these
Absolutely.
big scale issues like rioting and looting, because those, I mean, rioting and looting, those are decisions that people make.
Absolutely. And
They see an
mass.
opportunity, someone starts, and then everyone else goes, all right, well,
Yes.
then it becomes a survival thing where it's like you have to do that to survive now. And I think it's really important during times of great stress to remember the things that matter, you know, most, and who we are as people and what we want to be remembered for, you know.
Yes. So very quickly, I just want to say that, once again, it's like the heroes versus the worst side of humanity. So when we look back at World War II, you can look at the history of it, and in the history books, we really learn about the negative stuff more so, which I think is kind of what we have to do. You got to teach kids about Hitler. You got to teach them about Stalin. You got to teach them about Mussolini, even Japan, right? What they did in China. It's important that they know that. You can't gloss over those events. Especially the rise of Hitler is very, very important to understand. Because that's how people did those unspeakable acts.
It
They
was
didn't
done
just
legally. Hitler rose
right.
to power
Well,
through the legal system, which is very
it,
fascinating. He didn't just
right.
like take control as people might think.
And I love
He was
teaching
elected.
about this, right? Because there's this term false flag that we hear very, very often. People will attribute this to 9/11 and various other things, there might be scant evidence perhaps of that, but I think enough people in this collective now look at 9/11 as being, in a sense, a false flag because what it led to down the road.
Mhm.
Whoever did it, whatever, that's not, we're not going to discuss that here. We'd be here for the next 5 years if we were discussing
Yeah.
something like that. Because the amount of information that's been put out there over the past 20 years regarding the events on that day. But ultimately, we need to understand that, especially in times of crisis, people take advantage of them, right? People in power are going to use the crisis to create a narrative, right, that benefits their end goals, their whatever basically future they want to create. So with Hitler, like you said, he came to power legally. He did not. He did try to launch a coup early in the 1920s called the Beer Hall Putsch. He tried to get the Nazis into power, or the German Workers' Party, I think they were called at that point. They weren't necessarily Nazis just yet, and he failed. And I always love telling the kids about this because he sent to jail. He's supposed to serve a few years sentence. He's not allowed to give public speeches anymore. And in his time in jail, he writes Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And we all have a struggle. Our whole lives are a struggle. I agree with that. His struggle was legitimate in the sense that he fought in World War I. He faced poisonous gas. So he had health problems from the war. He had felt the pain of fighting for Germany and Germany losing the war. And it's very important to understand the Treaty of Versailles, the document that was signed after World War I, because what it did was put enormous strain and blame on Germany. All right, so the German economy collapsed essentially. It was being propped up by U.S. Government, essentially loans. Basically, France and Britain were bankrupt after World War I because of all the money they spent on building bombs and essentially funding the war effort. So France and Britain needed to get their debt paid off. So they said, we're going to get Germany to pay off our debt. But Germany's also broke. So the U.S. is just funneling essentially, monopoly money to Germany, and Germany is trying to pay off the Allies, and you have this circle of debt that ultimately ends up leading to the Great Depression. All right, and I won't get too much into that. You can look into that if you want to. It's a very interesting point of history where you kind of see how all these countries are once again interconnected.
Right.
Right.
So it's like the conditions of the country at the time, because of the great stress and crisis, they essentially pushed together for somebody to express that like deep unconscious. And there was a lot of
Absolutely.
good intentions and a lot of collective evils that came out in this person. And it's arguable that
Absolutely.
if it wasn't Adolf Hitler who had done it, it would have been someone else, because there was such pressure at the time for something like that to occur. It's World War II is a very fascinating time because you see the rise of dictatorships all across the world at the same time,
Absolutely.
as if it's like this collective fight against something, that some very pivotal thing is happening in the what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. And
Right.
I feel in a sense that during these times, with these outbreaks, there's a lot of factors coming through the just collective unconscious of humanity that's causing us to look back and reflect on ourselves. And it's not just business as usual. Like something's different. It's
No,
um,
no.
different times. And that's the thing, is how what aspects of our nature will be shown by how we deal with all of this. Really, do we come
So let me,
together, do we cooperate, or does it descend into chaos?
well, yeah, and you can kind of cooperate into chaos. So you have,
That's what
because that's what
happened.
we're going to see with Hitler, right? So let me just finish that story there. So you have the
Mhm.
Treaty of Versailles. It punishes Germany harshly. They're in serious debt. It takes a wheelbarrow full of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Insane poverty. The republic that was created, the Weimar Republic, a democratic government for Germany after the Kaiser was kicked out after World War One, is inefficient. It doesn't really work. Coalitions can't form. So ultimately, that's why you see, and you said all across the world, these dictatorships are forming. It's because people are dissatisfied with what they're told, what they were told was supposed to be the saving grace, right? Oh, we have representative government now. Your pleas will be heard. Your whatever you need will be provided for, and that's not happening. So people listen to someone like Hitler, who, by the way, like I said, he was supposed to serve the jail time. He was released after 9 months. He was allowed to speak again. So no one followed through on this man's coup against the government. So,
Well,
okay,
he had many
like,
supporters, actually. I
right.
remember watching this. There's this really interesting documentary on Netflix. It's called something like Hitler's Inner Circle of Evil or something like that, and
Yes, yes, we were talking about this.
it chronicles the rise to power of multiple individuals who became kind of like the lead people within the Nazi party, including Hitler, who was actually just a partial instrument of that whole party because they were all cooperating
Sure,
together. Um,
sure.
and what that series shows is that he was speaking to some of the most negative aspects in people, but they were true. That's why they gathered response. And he gives this when he's actually indicted to go to prison, he gives this speech. Like so he was supposed to have basically a court case against him. Um, and this like a question and answer type format, asking about it, what he did, why he did it, and giving him
Mm.
his sentence. But it actually completely devolved, and he just started giving a speech to this group of people,
Uh,
and a lot of people in the audience, I believe, actually applauded him and supported what he was doing, even though they later went on to imprison him. But they let him out with a very light sentence because a lot of the
exactly.
people within the government actually supported what he was doing. Um, so
Well, he was
yeah,
speaking about the problems of Germany, Bogdan, and they were real problems. The people were suffering. The people were starving. The economy was destroyed. Their sense of identity had been crushed. So I understand. Whenever I teach early Hitler, I always say like this actually makes sense. Like he not I'm not trying to argue for anti-Semitism necessarily, but what the core problems in Germany, he was trying to address them by saying we've been screwed over. The Allies don't care about us. We need to protect Germany. We need to fight for Germany ourselves, Germans ourselves, in order to lift ourselves up again. And that is why people applauded him during that speech. That is also why when the Reichstag burned down, okay, which is the great seminal event that led to his being appointed chancellor, with the Enabling Act, I believe 1931, 31, 33 was that time frame where this all kind of goes down. He is able to say that, yes, some communists, foreign communists, did this to us. The communists are our enemies. Jews and communists were being grouped together back in the day there, which is very interesting if you think about it. And he was able to kind of loop these enemies together and say, these are the people against us, the foreigners, the communists. They did this to us. They are trying to kill Germany from within, and we cannot allow this. We need a strong, forget democracy. We need this is a crazy time, a time of crisis. We need to have a dictator. We need to have someone who's going to take charge and protect the people of Germany. And for their best interests. And so he's able to take power that way. The old General Hindenburg reluctantly signs off and gives Hitler the powers to essentially become dictator. And ultimately, it's a slow and steady roll from there. There's a great scene in a show that I show the kids, a clip where basically the Hitler's trying to say, like, we have to suspend all freedom of the press, freedom of speech. we're going to look through your letters from now on. There's no more privacy because we need to do this to protect Germany. And
Mm,
obviously, there's still half the people in the room that are not okay with that, right? People on the other side, the other political parties, they don't want this. But what do the Nazis start doing? They get up and they start singing a song about Germany overall, Deutschland über alles. All right. And if you don't get up and sing, aren't you like the enemies? And so everyone starts feeling this mass hysteria, this herd mentality. Well, if I don't join along, I look like the problem here. And so
mm,
ultimately, he's able to convince people to follow along with him. He is an excellent orator. You listen to those speeches, man, you get the chills because this man, like you said, is hitting on some of those deep shadow elements of humanity and those emotions that you have of feeling powerless. And he makes you feel like he's giving you that power. I don't know where it's coming from. It's coming from the depths of somewhere, right? And ultimately, that's kind of what propels him in Germany into this kind of scenario that becomes nightmarish over the next few years. I think the Jews were scapegoated, communists were scapegoated, degenerates, handicapped people were scapegoated. He was able to push this ideology of eugenics, which did not originate in Germany by any means. This originated in the United States and United Kingdom. A lot of people held these ideas about eugenics throughout the world. Hitler was just kind of the mouthpiece for that. You have people in the United States like Charles Lindbergh, Nazi sympathizers, Henry Ford, who were really kind of okay with Hitler. He was Time's Man of the Year, Time Magazine's Man of the Year in the mid-30s because he did help Germany. He was bringing back some semblance of order and prosperity to
mm.
this downtrodden people. And that's kind of what then convinced people to go along with, well, if he did this for us, now it's, I guess I'll do this also, even though morally I may not feel okay with this. What else can we do? We came this far. We're not going to go back now. And at that point, it's kind of a snowball effect.
Right. And so it's the perfect example of how if we don't examine what's going on during a crisis, it can lead to unimaginable evil that seems justified at the time. And then, you wake up a few years later and you're like, how did this happen? And it's like every single person's decisions all along the way led to this event. And much of the most unsavory aspects of human nature came out and led to unimaginable state sponsored evil. And no country was free from evil during World War II. It's often painted as if, the Axis was evil and the Allies were good, but the Allies were doing city bombings on innocent civilians. The Axis was doing horrible things, basically committing genocides all over the world. And, it's an interesting thing. And what I want to get into on that subject is what do these events, which were pretty recent actually, I mean, 70, 80
Absolutely.
years ago,
People are
the
still alive
world
that lived through
devolved
them.
into chaos, and millions of people died. I think the number is in hundreds of millions. um what can we learn from an event like that in our times now, and what does it tell us about the human psyche, really?
It's a loaded question, Bog, and it's not easy to learn from something like that. Like you said, there's so many different events. For instance, I believe the British were the first ones to actually start bombing cities. Am I mistaken with that? I believe they kind of got the ball rolling there. So, like you said, there's no. Obviously, we look in hindsight and say they were the good guys, they were the bad guys. But the United States essentially forced Japanese citizens who had been living in the country, owned businesses, owned homes, to get up and go into, they weren't as bad as concentration camps, but they were detention camps, internment camps. And those people never got back their businesses. They lost most of their wealth if they had any. And that was a great travesty. And I know that Franklin Roosevelt kind of felt bad about it. His wife especially was against it, but he felt like his back was against the wall. And that is the danger, is when we feel like our backs are against the wall. And if we're being told our backs are up against the wall, that's when we start acting rashly. We're not thinking about long-term consequences, and terrible, terrible things can happen. So, but very quickly, I just want to get back to the heroes, because some of the great movies that we see about World War II, like Schindler's List, right? You have a man who's able to save thousands of innocent Jewish people's lives who would have been killed in death camps. There are countless stories throughout Europe of people that were, protected ultimately by the Catholic Church, by other groups, just regular citizens, individuals who decided, I'm going to risk my life to protect people that ultimately did nothing to me. Yes, I'm being told to demonize them, but ultimately, who am I being told to demonize them by? Some of the greatest demons that ever existed on the face of the earth, right? So I think it's very important for us to not get too ahead of ourselves here, and to not start losing our minds, because that's really what it is. And like you said, it's people losing their minds. They're losing their sense of rationality, but they're most importantly losing their sense of empathy, their sense of compassion for others. You think of Black Friday, right? Every year, Black Friday. I wonder what Black Friday will be like this year, right? I wonder if we'll learn anything from this. Is it worth fighting someone, wrestling someone over a piece of an electronic equipment that really doesn't, it's not important for you to survive with it, right? It's not a piece of food or water that's going to keep you sustained on this planet. So I think it's very important that we start to even look back at recent history, especially now, and be like, wow, the way that we've been acting is scary. And we need to evaluate our actions and our reactions to events and circumstances, because they're not realistic. There's no reason for us to freak out over some of these little mundane things when there have been such greater disasters in the past in history that people have gone through. So I think, to get back to your question, we need to look at history and the events from the past to see, like you said, how do people react, in order to not respond in a detrimental way, but maybe see, oh, there were people that risked their lives to save some of the people that were being condemned to death by various groups. I want to be like those people. I don't want to be like the ones that just went along with the crowd, went along with the scourge of the herd mentality, in order to kind of save face and to stay on the right side of history, because those Germans thought they were on the right side of history. Because they were taught that they were. They were taught they were saving the Aryan race. They're from this great, Hitler was playing on the lessons of history, the Aryans, these great people. This is who we descend from. We must reclaim these people. We must, live through them, or allow them to live through us once more. And so people bought this hook, line, and sinker, and they were way too deep in at a certain point to be able to walk back. About the movie Operation Valkyrie, where people did try to kill Hitler because they saw that this was going bad for Germany. This was not going to end well. So even in those late stages, people were still saying, we want to get out. We don't want in this anymore, this crazy train, wherever the hell it's going. We want off. And ultimately, people were willing to sacrifice their lives for that.
And if the Axis had won the war, we would be telling a completely different history, wouldn't we?
Oh, yeah.
If we were still alive in the same way. The history of the whole war would have been completely different, even to this point, even 70, 80 years later. And there's the saying that, history is written by the victors.
Oh, yes.
Not necessarily by who is good or who is right, but by the people who win. And what do you think is a useful way to look into history so that we don't fall into that surface level understanding of what happened? Because obviously a lot of state propaganda comes in the form of history. Like, this is what you believe in 1984, that book by
Yes,
by Orwell
George
is a
Orwell.
perfect example of how a state will rewrite history to create like a new narrative for the future, because
Indeed.
where we have been is where we are going also.
Well, I think it's very that's the most important here is, and people say this all the time, you have to look at things objectively, but we say that, and I don't know if that's really actually the whole answer. I
Hmm.
think we need to look at it with our hearts also, and try to bring empathy into it, and bring our that's what really makes us human. Otherwise, we're just robots. We're just like, an automaton. If we look at things, well, this makes sense, and this is the way, this is the best outcome for me, so I'm going to do this. That might not be the best outcome for the majority of people. That might not be the right thing to do, ultimately, in hindsight. So I'll bring up the United States, for instance, now, because this is kind of where a lot of my awakening came from.
Hmm.
I didn't grow up naively thinking necessarily that we are the shining city on the hill, or that we are should be the policemen of the world necessarily. But I do value our freedoms here in this country, and I think I've really hit a stride with that now, especially as a teacher, where I remind the kids, especially when I'm teaching World War II, like, if this had gone differently, a lot of you would not be here right now. We would not be talking about things so freely. This would be a nightmare of a world in some ways, compared to the relative peace and prosperity that we have in our world today. And I hammer that point home. In a way, I almost want to scare the daylights out of them, for them to think about what could have been.
And
in a
it
world like that.
shows, sorry to interrupt here,
No,
but
no,
I
no,
just want to
please.
bring in the idea that what's happening now with this crisis really shows how fragile all of this really is. How
Yeah, yeah.
fragile our society is, how fragile, you know, consumerism and like the production of goods and the buying of goods really is, when even just a very seemingly mild thing happens, um, in terms of what's actually happening, the response shows that a lot of society seems to be a house of cards.
We were
That,
coasting, Bogdan. We were
yeah.
complacent. Our generation, especially ours, and even our parents have
Mhm.
no idea of the hardships. Unless your parents or you had parents that lived through, or relatives that lived through communism, perhaps. Maybe
Mhm.
then they knew a little bit about the hardships, or perhaps they were living in a country under one of the imperialist wars of the United States, right? We're spreading freedom around, and that's a really great motif to use, but that's not the case on the ground. You look at a country like Iraq, for instance, where millions of people, potentially have died in the last 20 years because of our actions over there. And yes, we did topple Saddam Hussein, terrible dictator. No one's arguing that Saddam Hussein should be in power right now, but at the same time, we unearthed some age-old conflicts in Iraq. Iraq should never have been a country. It was drawn up in the Sykes-Picot Agreement between the French and the English after World War One. Another great decision, an agreement that was made right after World War One, just like the Treaty of Versailles, that led to long-lasting, awful effects for the world stage. You have the Kurds who live up in the north of Iraq. You have the Sunnis, essentially in the central of Iraq, and then you have the Shias in the south. You have three different ethnic groups who, essentially, two of them are, well, all of them have different religions in a sense. Shia Muslims are much more like, they side with the Iranians. They're about 20%, 25% of the worldwide population of Muslims. They're like the minority sect, and the Sunni sect is much larger, 70% plus, the majority sect in the world. So Iraq is a powder keg for civil war, for sectarian violence, and that's what happened after we went in there. Yes, we got rid of Saddam, but we had no plan for after Saddam. We thought, oh, we'll just give them a democracy. They'll figure it out on their own. It's all going to be fantastic. Uh, yeah, that sounds awesome on paper, but that's not what ended up happening, as we well know. And so for me growing up, that's how I learned, was how to look at history, was by looking at the current events and seeing, holy cow, our own country is making serious, serious mistakes right now that are going to affect us probably for the rest of our lives down the road. And so that's really what taught me, was seeing how our media might be telling us that what we're doing is necessary, that what we're doing is good. Girls in Afghanistan can go to school now. That's awesome. I totally think that's positive, but is that the whole story? Right? Why are we really over there? What is really going on? Perhaps we'd be better off just letting the people self-determine their own states and their own livelihoods. Maybe some people want to live under theocratic law. Maybe some people in the Middle East want that sort of lifestyle. Who are we to tell them that's not okay? Um, Granted, you might not want to live that way. I might not agree with Sharia law, and particularly some of the precepts that go along with that. But I don't know if we're doing any better by going over there and forcing people to change their ways of life, because all we're doing is creating more animosity, especially towards our way of life, which is very free-flowing and very allowing. And now we've created this conflict, like I said before, that will persist, potentially for generations. And it's a
Mm.
very deep seated wound that we've been putting band-aids over for far too long. And and it's funny because now what we're dealing with here is so big. Those wars seem minuscule in the face of
Mm.
what we're going through now, and that honestly is what scares me the most,
Mm.
because I always thought these were the big problems, and now, like, oh my god, these are actually paling in comparison now to what we're dealing with here at home.
Mm.
But I will say this: in some ways, we are due. Like I said when I started this rant over, just now, is that we have been complacent. Um, we were coasting. We haven't felt the effects of what we've done to some of these places around the world. And I'm not saying we, me, you, the children of this country, even people in their 30s, 40s, people just working on Wall Street, even, even our soldiers. They're not, they're they're pushing forward an agenda that's being told, they're essentially they have to do it. They have no choice, right? If you
Hmm.
disagree and say, no, I won't break into this person's house and arrest these potential terrorists, you're going to be court-martialed. You might face jail time. You can't risk that. You essentially must follow orders. And that's why it's scary right now. We're in a state where we must follow orders for our own good, because ultimately we don't know what the outcome is if we don't. And just happened in Vietnam, right? The same thing with these soldiers. They were their backs were against the wall. They had to do what they had to do in order to maintain and survive, right? So yeah,
Hmm.
okay, I am going to treat every civilian now as a potential threat, because they might, a little child might walk up to me with a grenade, or this woman might have, an IED under her burqa potentially. We don't know. So it puts humans in a state of fear, a state of distress constantly, and all of a sudden we're making rash decisions. And I think that's the greatest war
Mm.
crime, of the last. And there's been plenty of war crimes, but the main one is what we've done in the Middle East over the last 20 years. And
Mm.
I don't want to say anything else about what should be done with the people who cause these things, but I think it's clear that you look at what happened, and it's very sad, it's very disheartening, and it makes you question, what are we really fighting for? And kind of just to wrap this up here, because I do this with my students very often, is kind of focus on all the terrible things, and like, because we're not aware of it. We're really not aware to the extent, because we're told that we're so great and so awesome that, that we've done these terrible things, or that we, at least allowed it and didn't hold up a microscope or a light to what was going on when it was happening. I do remind them that we are very lucky to live in this country. We do have a lot of freedoms. This country was, you can, to an extent, say was founded on proper ideals. Sure, there was slavery. There was still great inequality and terrible things that were happening, even by the people who wrote some of these great ideas. You can't ignore that. But we still have these freedoms. We must be thankful that, I say, every day you wake up in this country, you can kiss your pillow and be thankful you live here, because there's relative peace and prosperity here, unlike not just other parts of the world today, but other parts of the world throughout history. What we've had here is just a blessing, and we
Hmm.
need to be grateful for it, especially now, even when it seems like things are falling apart. We're not even close to that. We're still very
Right.
lucky. Things are still very good.
I think the theme that we keep touching on here is how historical events can bring out some of the worst things in the human psyche, and how to be on guard essentially against that occurring, and to keep our cool, because we are living in history right now. These events, it's hard to say what will happen, but they will certainly be significant, just because of the mass response that's happening on such a wide scale, and the participation of social media in this, the participation of pretty much every company in this, sending out notices of
Oh
what
my
their
God.
policies are. Everybody is commenting on this right now, and it's the most political involvement I've probably ever seen in my life, to be
You're
honest.
absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It's an
And
echo chamber.
what I want to touch on here is, what are some of the things that you learned from your studies of history that you think have made you a better person, that have made you wiser?
That is a very hard answer, or sorry, a hard question to answer. Um, I'm gonna go on a limb here, and I'm just gonna explain how I got into history, because I think that's maybe the best way to do this.
Hmm.
Maybe the answer will come out as I
Okay.
tell this little story, because that's really what history is. It's just stories, right? Narratives that we're telling. It's not exactly how things went down. It's just one perspective, but it's the best we can do. So, like I said before, I'm a very proud half-blooded Greek. My grandmother, my yaya, my mother were born on the island of Samos in Greece right now. In Greece right now, they're facing some trials with the whole migrant crisis with Turkey, where you have a bunch of migrants, and this is another terrible effect of those wars that we saw. Or that I was talking about a moment ago in the Middle East, is that you have all these refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Africa as well, Libya, and they're funneling in because they're trying to escape the chaos that was created. Um, so right now, Greece is facing a trial, not just the virus, like all countries are, but they're facing a trial that they've been dealing with for the last 4 or 5 years, and now it's hitting a head again. And I won't get too far into that, because that's another story for another day. But just to say that, this is where I come from. This is who I identified with growing up. And it means a lot to me to be Greek, because especially because I don't look it. I have red hair. People just think I'm an Irish dude. It's St. Patrick's Day. And no, I'm not Irish. I'm not any percent Irish at all. I'm Greek. I'm a little bit Italian, a little bit Swedish, right? I got a mix of a bunch of different things. But being Greek is who I am, and it was instilled in me as a child. My yaya would tell me about what it meant to be Greek. I learned Greek. I'm not fluent necessarily, but I can speak pretty well. I can understand. I can write a little bit. I went to Greek school for many years, took Greek in college. It was a big part of my identity. It gave me a sense of purpose. It gave me a sense of pride, to be happy about who I am. And so even when I was young, I had a big book with a map of the world, and my yaya would tell me stories. She'd point to Greece, this little country on the map, and tell me stories about what happened before she was born, what her grandmother went through. There was a great tragedy at the end of World War I also. A lot of stuff went down at the end of World War I, where there was essentially, a genocide, of not just Armenians, but some Greeks too, on the western coast of Turkey, modern day Turkey. And a lot of refugees left essentially Smyrna and some of these cities on the western coast and went over to Samos and other islands and left Greece. There was this great population exchange. A lot of Turks left Greece to go back to Turkey, and a lot of Greeks left Turkey to go to Greece. And it kind of was this, disaster ensued essentially. And she would tell me about this. And for someone who was 5, 6, 7 years old to learn these lessons of history, it became very normal for me. To that suffering and hardship was a very big part of life. Even though I personally wasn't experiencing that at all, my life was very cushy. I was very blessed. I had all the food I could ever need, all the clothes I would ever need. I had loving parents, loving grandparents. I was very lucky growing up. But I still had this sense of, and this might be the lesson that you learn from history, is that things are actually, they can be very bad. And it takes a very short period of time for things to get very crazy, very hectic, and for people to lose their heads. And so nowadays, that's kind of what motivated me to essentially pursue history, was to learn all about Greece, to learn all about my people, who I am, and the blood that flows through my veins, right? I became aware of that, the nature of that, through reading the books, talking to my ancestors, talking to my parents and whatnot about who I am. And it informed me. History informs you. It should inform you about yourself, even if you're not learning about history from your own people. I'm very blessed that I have that connection. The Greeks in Western history were some of the first people to write down and recorded history. I mentioned Herodotus, Thucydides. I feel very blessed to come from this lineage, all right, of some of the, the foundations of the Western world, our government, our education system, our ways of thought, even our science, our medicine, in a lot of ways ties back to this. And so I feel like it is living. For me, it's living because I see it. I see it, how it's still reverberating from the past, all the way, from those ancient times. And so that's kind of how it all came to be for me, is that I kind of just lived it. I never questioned it. I sort of embodied this history, and I thought, yeah, I want to be a history teacher because I love it. I feel I love it because it is me, and I want to love myself. And I think that's the ultimate goal of our lives, is to love ourselves, accept ourselves for who we are. And so let's say you were adopted, you're an orphan, perhaps maybe even you take one of those genealogy tests in order to find out where your people come from. And I think that's really good, because I think that's going to help you feel a sense of purpose, a sense of continuity, that you're not just living in isolation, that you're not just some random person on this earth with no purpose, going from one Netflix show to another, binge watching, and what the hell am I going to do tomorrow? I don't know what's going on. I want to feel like I'm here for a reason. And so for me, luckily, history was the way to do that. And I think now some people are connecting with their past, their ancestors, even if they don't have living ancestors to talk to about that. They can see, oh, I came from here. Oh, I can learn about this place. And learning about that history ultimately gives you the story of your ancestors, and it gives you, just gives you that sense of connection. And I think that's what mythology does. And, we'll get into this eventually, maybe on a later episode, perhaps. It kind of gives us that sense of timelessness of humanity, and that we're not just alone on a rock floating with no sense of purpose, waiting
Right.
to go back into the ground. There is a greater purpose to this, and we have to discover it. And it takes effort. And I think history is just one way to kind of get into that and sort of
Mm.
start writing our own story, is by reading the stories of those in the past, um, and yeah, creating that purpose for ourselves.
So there's a Carl Jung quote that corresponds directly with this.
Excellent.
It goes, "Man is not a machine that can be remodeled for quite other purposes as occasion demands, in the hope that it will go on functioning as regularly as before, but in a quite different way. He or she carries his whole history with him. In his very structure is written the history of humankind. The historical element in man represents a vital need to which a wise psychic economy must respond. Somehow the past must come alive and participate in the present." So this is this idea that we cannot be separable from our history, from the history of Western civilization, from the history of the traditions that we come from, and to pretend that we're, modern people separated from all of the ancient forces within humanity and the archetypes and the great evils that have ever been committed by humanity are committable by us. It's not like we've suddenly gone beyond. And also, the greatest good that has ever happened also
Exactly.
came from humanity. And it also is a potential with us. So to me, I too got very fascinated in the more the atrocities of history, war and famine and mass murder and all these, because these are things that we do not speak of often
Ah, yes.
as being potentials for what a human can do. And these are potentials for just an ordinary person, not even necessarily a psychopath, that if the social conditions are such, people can be led to great evil. So the lesson for me from history and from learning all this is just to really live my own life, to be aware of all
Yes.
the mistakes that the ancients have made, and all the great things that they've done, and know that I and everyone I know is a pivotal aspect of everything, that we have great influence by the way that we act, by our seemingly insignificant choices. We alter things in great ways. Um, I know Jordan Peterson talks a lot about the Gulag Archipelago, which I've been meaning to read. I think an audiobook is coming out soon. I'm definitely going to be checking out. But basically, um, there's this guy, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, that
Oh, yes.
basically wrote about the evils of the gulags and the Soviet Union at the time where they were at its worst. Actually, he was imprisoned, and he wrote a lot of these works that were very political. Later, after he was released, he just kept them in his mind. But anyway, the point of that is that many people cite him as one of the major factors in the collapse of the Soviet Union. That here's just this writer who
Yes.
who observed what was going on, spoke the truth, in fact, was imprisoned for a very long time because of it. Um, but what he did ended up influencing the whole world, actually. And he wasn't anybody particularly special. He was just a person who noticed what was going on and went with what he thought was right. He did what he believed to be right, and where other people were looking away and not commenting out of fear, mostly, he went ahead and he took the initiative, which ended up leading to great evil upon himself, but which he eventually found his way out of. So, to me, history is, it shows how much of a big difference we can make in how we act, and that we have the potential to do great harm to people or to be of great benefit. And it's really a decision that each of us has to make. And like, what kind of people do we want to be, rather than just going along with what society requests of us. And I'm not exactly sure how all of that really relates to what's going on directly now, but I guess it remains to be seen because it's very, very early in this event. And the piece that I take away is to just continue doing the best that I can, to be a good person, to help people, to avoid making any mistakes, because we all contribute to this, in
Hagen,
some way.
I'm so happy that you brought up the individual, because that's really what it comes down to. When we learn history, we always, and when I was younger, this is how I viewed history, is that you follow the leaders, the people who were in power, the wars they fought, what places they took over, and that's it. And that's history. But that is like, it's honestly the worst part of history. It's the most, it's almost deceiving, that part of history, because that's very superficial. Because what really matters is going on underneath the surface. Like you said, an individual who lived through, one of the most important political maneuvers in history with the whole Gulag creation in the Soviet Union, he was able to have more of an impact, you could argue, than even Stalin himself. Even though Stalin, yes, mass murderer, tens of millions of people, horrible guy, changed Russia. You could argue that the way he industrialized the 5-year plans allowed Russia to even beat the Nazis. So there's a positive there, even if you want to look at it that way. But really, it comes down to when you read about an individual in history, and this is why I think biographies are really important.
Mm-hmm.
You're bringing them to life, and they're living through you. We think about archetypes as these general, abstract sort of character traits. But I want to take a leap here and say that archetypes are individuals, and that when we read about an individual who lived, who made an impact, we are actually embodying them if we care to. So if you want to be a whistleblower, let's say, and you work in a government agency, you might want to read a little bit about Edward Snowden, right? If you want to be, or let's say you want to be a social advocate, or they say social justice warrior today, right? That's the big term. You might want to read a little bit about Martin Luther King, right? Because these are the people, they might have not been president, right? They might have not been great generals or led armies into battle, but they did way more than that because their ideas changed the world. And I think that's, like you said, it remains to be seen who will be our heroes nowadays with what we're going on right now. I think it'll be people like you and me, or any of the people that you've interviewed on your excellent podcast series, because we're all working in this together. We all need each other. We all have little bits of knowledge here and there to piece together this quilt that's going to essentially keep humanity alive throughout these troubling times. We need to know how to heal ourselves naturally. We need to know how to deal with our mental health in a positive way. We should also know, entertainment. I would say history in a lot of ways is entertainment. We're just learning, for fun and to see what happened. But that entertainment can be very informative, and it can lead us to become better people, more informed people. And we could, we become more authoritative when we learn more, and people hear that, right? And that's why, when kids listen to me, I think what they see is not so much what I'm talking about, the passion that I have, the fact that they can see I'm devoted to this. And I think they're thinking, why does he care so much? And I think that's what we need in this world. We need less apathy. We need a lot more passion and commitment to what it is that we're into these days. It's very important that we start to focus on being the best people that we can be and become passionate individuals that give it our all every single day, day in, day out, because we don't know how much time we have here. We can't just say, I'll do this and that tomorrow. Now is the time.
Yeah, and history is the collected stories of humanity and the expression of the collective unconscious and the collective psyche of humanity and what that leads to. So it's a treasure trove of personal insights, actually, because history is just made up of individuals interacting with each other. That's all of history is, either nations interacting abstractly, people interacting. And it's popular to think of society as like existing almost like outside of ourselves or something, that
Oh yeah.
there's this thing, it's called society, and there's this thing called government, but really we are it. Like how we act is what it becomes. Like no one really has say over our lives other than ourselves or what we go along with. So I think that that's really really empowering for people to know that um, in all spheres, although they are influenced by external factors, obviously, they have say of what happens in their life. Like especially for health, for example, to tie it back to health, is the decisions you make, the little decisions that seem insignificant, affect your health, mental, physical. Your actions affect the political situation also. Everyone feeds into everything. So I think it brings us a great sense of responsibility about our lives and doing what we can. And during these times, I think it's really important just to keep our cool, make the most out of the situation. I think in times of great darkness, the greatest light can come out. That's something that I've definitely seen in my life and throughout history. And let's see
Absolutely.
what the light of this all is. I mean, who knows? There could be very, very good consequences of all this. Maybe it'll increase community. Maybe people will understand how fragile this thing called Western civilization is that we all single-handedly built and now is threatened with the stock market plummeting and everyone kind of being in a uh, me versus the world type of instinctual response. And everyone feels that to some extent, but I challenge people to see the good in the situation and see how there's some kind of lesson in this all, and that there's something that we can learn for ourselves, and that we can influence and learn things for the future also that will affect us.
And just like a virus spreads, Bogdan, ideas spread. And I think it's very important that, like I said before, what you're doing with this is excellent because the world needs this. And there's never enough people to do something like this. If you're listening right now and you think, oh, well, if I make a podcast, no one's going to listen, or, I don't know enough people, you just got to start somewhere. You can't, and that thought telling you can't do it, that's what's keeping humanity down. We really need to believe and have faith in ourselves. And I feel like that's kind of what's driven me as far as I've come, is that I believe strongly enough in myself and in what I love and what I'm passionate about, that it has led me to this point. You could say you want to be a teacher, you want to be a doctor, but if you don't put in the effort and live that life, like you live that, you are a teacher, you are a doctor when you go home and you take off your lab coat or you take off your tie and you're sitting at home. It doesn't stop. Learning is always ongoing, and it's so important that we remember that, because that's how we're going to overcome anything that faces us, is that we're always learning, we're always realizing that we can work towards something. It's not hopeless, it's never hopeless. It only becomes hopeless if we give up and like you said, give up our agency, give up our sovereignty to external forces and say, well, I can't fix this, I can't change this, it is what it is. There are certain things that you can't affect, but we can always we can always impact our own mindset. We can always create a certain outlook on how to deal with the world outside of us. And I think that's what's going to get us through these challenging times right now. And, I need this reminder just as much as anyone else does. These are tough times. These are, it gets pretty hairy out there. And, it's extremely important that I have talks with people like you and other people open-minded, that we remind ourselves that this is, this too shall pass, and that ultimately there could be some good that comes out of this, even if the news that we get gets worse and worse. It's very possible the next time we talk, things could somehow have gotten worse. But that's just the perspective ultimately, and that's something that could change. And we need to work very hard right now to be the captain of our own ship, and steer ourselves towards positive outlooks and positive mindsets, so we can at least deal with what comes, and like you said before, react in a way that will be beneficial for us in the long term. Because every little decision that we make to give into fear could lead us to an outcome that is not what we ultimately want.
Right. That's incredibly true. And I want to thank you for being on the podcast again. So we did a episode on astrology previously, but now we have gone into history and the psyche. And as we were discussing before, I wanted to make this kind of into a little bit of a series. We can get into a lot of other topics. I think an interesting place to go into next time is more like ancient history, archetypes, the history of mythology, how it impacts the psyche and mind. And all of this that we're talking about really brings out the holistic aspect of history, that history isn't, as Jung says, it's not in thick books, it's in our very blood, that our traditions, where we come from, it's important to know, because there's this saying so much that it's basically a cliche now, but if you don't know where you're from, you don't know where you're going.
Indeed.
And I think a lot of the journey of self-discovery of humanity is finding out, who we are, where we come from, because that informs who we will become, in a
Indeed.
sense, because everything that precedes us leads to this. I mean, even just the response to this whole outbreak, it reminds me that there's this like deep, almost subconscious fear of this kind of like plague that exists within us. And it might even be, biological from millions of years ago. And it's certainly more recent with the Spanish flu and the bubonic plague and things like that, where humanity remembers like, oh, this could be really bad. Like, right? So perhaps everything is being done exactly as it should be, and all will come into harmony. It's hard to say, but I mean, for now, we do what we can, try to keep ourselves healthy, try to help people out as much as we can, not lose our cool too much, just, see what it all has to offer, and make the most of it. I mean, these kind of awesome times in a lot of ways too. I mean, more free time than we know what to do with in a lot of
Oh
cases.
man, it's an opportunity, man. I mean, I'm gonna use this time to not just work on the things that I always work on, but to read even more, to play as much music as possible. We can't. This is not the time to become hopeless. This is the time to like you said, like we're always complaining in this society. We don't have enough time for this. We work too hard. There's I can never get enough sleep. Well,
Hmm.
now we can do all these things that we said we've been wanting to do for a long time.
And it
Let's get with it.
shows that the reason that we weren't doing those things is not because we didn't have time, but because there's many
Ah,
blocks. There's many psychic blocks. So all this free time now exposes like, all the things that you want to do, but are difficult for reasons
yeah.
that you may have not expected. So now is a time of discovery of like, for people that don't have work, or schools closed, or people within my community where clinic is closed, is like, what do you do with free time when you don't have like a scheduled thing to do? And it's an interesting question, and one that I'm actively working on. I mean, this is part of it, is doing episodes like this
Yeah.
to talk about things that I'm interested in. I'm always very fascinated by history because as I said before, I think it really expresses the collective psychology of humanity. And from that perspective, it's interesting because it's almost like reading yourself. When you read history, you read about people who are really just like you. I mean, people with the same struggles, with the same sufferings, with the same setbacks, but it shows like ways that humans can overcome the worst aspect of ourselves, bring out the best aspects, how to deal in crises, and all these. Um, there's this argument made for mythology, that mythology is just kind of thousands of years of history condensed into like
Oh, indeed.
short stories that encapsulate like, this is what happens when this thing happens to the human mind, and this is the way out of that aspect. This is what happens when like this struggle happens, and this is the way that people for millions of years have stumbled onto accidentally, that this is actually the way out of this state, that during times of crisis, um, being cooperative and actually seeking to be a positive aspect are actually more beneficial than just fending for ourselves, because we realize like actually how dependent we are on other people. Grocery stores close, and it's like, where do you get food from? Like I had that thought. I'm like, wow, everything is so fragile. Everything is so fragile, and people are working really hard to support each other, and I think that's good, and that's what should be emphasized, not the fear, but the community, the let's band together, let's do what's right, and
Indeed. No, that
make
will
sure
lead
we
us
stay
to the
healthy.
promised land, Bogdan. If we work together to get through this, we'll be fine.
Ja
Um,
ja.
and I was going to say Bob Marley, actually, quote, I was literally just thinking, it's in the song Rat Race. He
Mm.
says, know your history, so you know your destiny. And that's really where it comes into here. It's not straightforward for everyone, but like you said, the story of history, you're reading about yourself when you're reading about history, because you could be anyone born at any time period, male, female, different races. It really doesn't. You're random. Like you are what you are in this life, and that is what it is. But when you read history, you can put yourself in the shoes of anyone, and that allows you to really take a step back and consider other circumstances that you could potentially be in. So people who read about plagues in the past right now probably feel like a little more prepared than people who never even knew there was anything like this going on. And because, like you said, grocery stores, people take these things for granted. Most of history, there was no steady source of food like this. People had to rely on themselves and others, especially communities. They kept each other afloat, and now we don't really know our neighbor. We're a little more isolated. So this is why it's a little scarier, because we don't have those social safety nets that people relied upon for thousands of years, because we've had such prosperity and such peace that we almost don't know what to do with ourselves now. But I'm going to, try to make a good prediction here and say that we're going to go back to our roots here. And that's the goal of history, right? Is to understand our roots and where we come from. And I think we're kind of being forced to do that now. And it will be hard at first to do that. I think it's going to take a lot of growing pains to bring us back to where we once were. But I think once we get through these first few weeks, maybe even a month or two, we'll start to remember how to live again. And
Mm.
I think we all will. I think we're all, to an extent, kind of caught up in this modern Western
Yeah.
society, civilization. And
There's something so
we need to, yeah, take a
fascinating
step back.
that's happening that I noticed in the weeks before all of this happened. I noticed that people, and myself included, in a lot of ways, were just exhausted by the usual routines.
Mm,
Like there was just an overall sense of like exhaustion. I mean, obviously it was in the depth of winter, and this
right,
like
right.
go 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 mentality, and now it's just like empty air. It's really interesting, and it makes me wonder if not this is like exactly what needed to happen for people to take that rest for themselves that people maybe so deeply subconsciously wanted, that it actually came to manifestation and was forced upon them as if by an external source. I don't know,
Oh
just
man.
musings,
Uh,
but let's
yeah,
make the most
no,
of it.
that's wise, brother Bogdan. You always get those deep psychological truths, and you're able to elucidate them for your listeners. And I think it's very important, like I said before, that we have these talks, that people listen in, and they spread these ideas. That we're not afraid to talk about these things with people. So if someone says, actually, what we're going through right now could be a really good thing, everyone might look at you and be like, is that guy crazy? Is he insane? But they might come around to that, and it's good you introduce them to that idea now before they start rioting in the streets,
Mm,
right? Because you got to start putting out the positive ideas now before things do start to perhaps unravel further. Because, excuse me, people might not feel hopeful at that point, and that could lead to the negative things. So we got to introduce those little seeds of optimism now more than ever.
yeah, I certainly don't see it going in that direction. I think if it would have gone in that direction, it would have already gone in that direction. Um, Notwithstanding future changes. Um, so for now, these are interesting times. We're living in history right now, and
Flowing through our veins.
yeah, exactly. Well, thank you, Sir Eric Anderson, for being on the show, and I want to continue doing these episodes about history because I am definitely a history buff, and I think that there's much to be learned psychologically um, from history, and that's the reason for even including this on a podcast that really is about holistic health, because the past is such a big influence on psychology that it's impossible to go without talking about that. So that's why we're talking about it. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and thank Mr. Anderson from the Matrix for speaking to us about things that are important. So thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Boggs. And again, I look forward to speaking with you soon.